What will life be like post-COVID-19? Even though many of us have spent weeks dreaming about the day things are going to get back to normal, it may not be as smooth sailing as some of us would like. We can expect to see lots of changes, from simple things like our favourite cafe that didn't survive the shutdown to greeting friends now consisting of a nod or a wave rather than the old-fashioned hug. There'll be practical changes too, and there's also going to be economic changes that's going to affect our jobs, our property markets, and that's what I want to chat today with my guest Pete Wargent about. The fact that we've had a shock of a pandemic in our lifetime is going to mean that a lot of people's beliefs about the world are going to be shaken. Things like there's always going to be stability or nothing bad can happen. But there are going to be some positives coming out of that. That's part of what we're going to discuss today. However, unfortunately, those who lost income, lost their jobs, are also going to have practical concerns they've got to grapple with, like finding ways of meeting their financial commitments or getting the government benefits. There's also going to be challenges for property investors and business owners who are going to have to deal with loss of income, decreased income, changing world. So a lot of our concerns are going to be about economic issues, our futures, our careers, our income. And clearly, this is going to lead to a bit more stress and anxiety. But if you've been listening to my podcast for a while or following my writings, you know I'm an optimist. I'm not a pessimist, so this is not going to be a gloomy show. And while I'm generally optimistic, I believe I'm also realistic, and that's the type of information I want to share with you in today's show to prepare you for what's ahead. So welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's most trusted property commentator who has once again been voted Australia's leading property investment advisor. That's the fifth time he's won a similar award in the last 7 years.
A while ago, Scott Morrison was asked, what will our country look like when we're through this pandemic? Now, that's probably a question we're all asking ourselves. And interestingly, his answer was, as Australians go through the many months ahead, it'll change many of us for a long time to come. But he also said maybe that's not going to be in a bad way. So today, I would like to discuss what life could be like once we move through the pandemic with Pete Wargent. Now, you've got to be living under a rock if you don't know who Pete is. But if you're new to this podcast, Pete's a chartered accountant, chartered surveyor. He's got a financial planning diploma. But what impressed me more is that he's used his long-term approach to building businesses, investing in equities and owning a property portfolio to achieve his own financial independence. And he did that in the early 1930s. And now he's a leading property commentator, financial commentator on the property market, the stock market and the economy. Boy, what an introduction. Welcome, Pete.
Did you say early 1930s there, Michael, or did you mean early 30s?
Maybe I said it wrong.
I'm not that old.
I said you achieved financial independence in the 30s, but maybe I got carried away because we've known each other a long time, and I've been impressed how you started off writing your first book and you've grown and you've continuously daily put out podcasts and blogs and charts. So, Pete, today I'd like to talk about what life's going to be like, because the world is going to continue on, and many trends that were already underway are just going to maybe get there a little bit quicker. So I think we maybe got to see what the options are. I mean, this global emergency by a virus has really created an economic catastrophe in a lot of countries in the world, as policies have been put in place to prevent its spread. Now, I was just speaking to you before we started recording, and I saw that initially we were all pulling in it together. We all felt we were in the same boat to start with. But Pete, now I'm sensing feelings of anger, frustration, fatigue, because I think we've realised we're all in the same ocean, but we're not in the same boat. Pete, some of us are suffering more than others.
Yeah, I think that's the frustrations. You've seen that in America as well, lots of parts of Europe as well. I think people will, by and large, do the right thing, but then after a long period of time in isolation or shutdown, people start to get angry with the situation or just very frustrated. So obviously Australia's got different results around the country so far. Probably a bit of envy between the states, and there's obviously some politics as well in terms of state border closures. So yeah, there's a few different bits and pieces going on, but looking forward to chatting about it today.
Well, we don't know exactly what's going to come forward. It's probably going to take longer than many of us initially expected or initially hoped. And I believe travel is going to be restricted for longer than we expected. Will there be a cure? Won't there be a cure? Well, who knows? But if there's not, we're going to learn to live with it, Pete, just like we have with AIDS, just like we have with malaria. When I travelled in the good old days to Africa, or I remember we went on the Amazon, I knew there was malaria there, but I took tablets and I put on special clothes and I rubbed myself with special things and I got around and through and enjoyed my vacation. So I think we're going to come through this and live slightly differently, Pete.
Yeah, I mean, it's already happening. We know people are taking more precautions about the spread. You can have heat testing when you go into restaurants. I think in general, better treatments will be found, whether or not an actual vaccine becomes available. A lot of debate about whether or not that will happen, but some countries have generally found that after a period of time, things just start to improve. Maybe there's a herd immunity aspect as well. So there's a few unknowns there in terms of long-term consequences, but generally speaking, I think eventually we'll just start to pull out the other side. It just might take longer than we thought.
One of the things I got out of the recession of the 1990s was I became a much more cautious investor. I had a couple of decades of good times. We had a little recession in the 80s. We had ups and downs along the way. But going through a major crisis changed the way I think about the world and how I guess I lost some of my ego. And I think investors and business people who just thought life was going to be fantastic are going to approach things differently in a more cautious way moving forward.
Yeah, it's human nature. And we saw it particularly in Europe, where we were impacted much more significantly by the financial crisis 2007, 2009. I mean, it took a long period of time for confidence to come back. Plus, there was the Eurozone crisis, which sort of followed on from all of that. But things do eventually begin to come back. It's just human nature. If you've been through a tough period, you tend to be more cautious. And when things are bad, we think they'll stay bad forever and vice versa.
Sure. But I guess deep down we are social animals. We do want to socialise. I think also, Pete, we're lazy. We want to do whatever easiest and most convenient. And I think those two facts about human nature, far more than the coronavirus, are going to shape our future. We are who we are.
There's a lot of sort of knee-jerk commentary, but if you look back at previous global pandemics, eventually they pass. And after World War One, there was the Spanish flu, and much more widespread and significant in many ways. But then that was immediately followed by the Roaring Twenties, and one of the biggest boom decades in history. So a lot of extrapolation being done, but I suspect the relief as we come out the other side will actually see things powering back. But it just never feels like it when you're in the midst of a recession.
No, it doesn't while you're in it. Now, one of the things that was happening anyway, but I think it's going to continue on, is low interest rates. I guess we've got to get used to low interest rates, despite the Reserve Bank's best intentions. It wasn't prior to this able to get unemployment down or inflation in control. And now they're saying they're definitely not going to raise interest rates until unemployment comes down. That's going to be a few years, Pete.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to predict, but 4 or 5 years seems reasonable. If you look at the trend for unemployment and where unemployment should be, and we're going to be a long time till we get back down towards what they term full employment. Now, I guess, look, over the medium term, potentially we might see inflation come back. I think at the moment, because we've had a long period without much inflation, everyone's sort of moved onto that side of the boat. But eventually, businesses will want to start racking up or ratcheting up their fees and revenues to make up for lost ground. I think something which hasn't seen much airtime yet, but if we go through a period of lower immigration, and particularly because governments have actually furloughed so many workers, eventually businesses may well have to pay higher wages simply to get the skills and get people back into the workforce. that itself would also drive inflation. But I don't think that's going to happen quickly. I think low rates for the next 4 or 5 years are probably very likely. And that's the biggest support for asset prices, particularly property. I think if you've got the record low mortgage rates, when confidence returns, people will be drawn into property and equities just simply because the lack of returns from fixed interest.
Well, one of the points I was making was then we're going to have low interest rates. And I was also now going to say we're very likely going to have very low wages growth for a while because there is going to be spare capacity. So your point's interesting that for certain industries, yes, there probably is going to be the requirement to pay more, but we are going to be working differently. And at the moment, businesses seem to have spare capacity. So low interest rates are going to be good for property in the medium to long term, but lower wages growth, the lack of ability to pay more for properties is probably going to be on the downside.
Yeah, I think in skilled industries, I think wages growth might prove to be much stronger than we currently think. But I suspect that where the real underemployment, underutilization will be in the youth sector. It's usually those people are more marginal in the workforce. So I think for new graduates, youth workers, and people in certain industries like hospitality, I think wages growth will take a real knock there. But it might be a somewhat uneven effect in the years to come.
Oh, sure. And I think that's one of the things we've always mentioned, that there isn't one Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane property market or wherever. And so certain suburbs, certain areas, certain demographics, they're still doing okay. Despite unemployment being high, there's still probably about 80% of people who want a job, who've got a job, and some industries are doing particularly well. I think another trend we're going to see moving forward, Pete, is there's going to be greater public debt and probably more government intervention for a while. Interestingly, the government's intervened from both sides. There's been a bipartisan approach and no one's complained because they've done something in an unprecedented way. I guess they've learned from previous downturns.
Yeah, I think this is the big thing that's different from even 10 or 12 years ago, is that the stimulus and the response has been so quick and so big. And that's from central banks in terms of monetary policy and effectively money printing, but also from governments on the fiscal side. So yeah, much more government debt. I think we've also sort of seen a shift to the left. A lot of people are now looking to the government and saying, well, we need job guarantees or we need government projects to actually create employment. So without even really having ever voted for it, that's where politics is headed, and much more reliance on the government spending to push the economy, and huge deficits at the moment, which will take years to unwind.
Interestingly, Australia's in a better position than other countries in the world. So this is happening as a worldwide phenomenon, but Australia started off in pretty good condition. We were almost in surplus. The budget was looking better than other countries, and we've got good exchange policies at the moment. Iron ore's holding us up. So the government's borrowing at quite low interest rates. Are you worried about the government debt?
No, for Australia, as you mentioned, Australia had low government debt, comparatively speaking, before the crisis. And any concerns, we used to think, or there was, generally widely thought that if governments borrowed more, then potentially interest rates and yields would rise, but it just hasn't happened. Australia's issued some bonds over very long periods at just record low rates. So there's been no concerns on that side of things. So we'll be in deficit for a long time to come, but government debt in Australia, there's plenty of scope for that, and I expect that's what we'll see.
Well, some people are saying we're going to affect future generations, but it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. But I think moving forward, there is going to be a very uneven local recovery. Some states are doing better than others already. And interestingly, only when we were recording this podcast, ANZ came out with its spending. Every week now, the banks are showing what people are spending, how much is being spent in what areas. And other than Victoria, which understandably we can't spend, it being a bit locked down at the moment, people are outspending, and they're spending on different sort of things nowadays, Pete.
Yeah, in fact, we were talking about this just before we came on. And I think a lot of discretionary spend, particularly since the mining boom, as Australia has become a wealthier country, people tend to travel and spend their money overseas. Now, for a lot of people this year, that's not been an option. And therefore, we're seeing some really unusual spending trends. So, record high sales of luxury cars, things like Mercedes. Some people have accessed their superannuation early, so that's being spent on luxury goods or jet skis. And there's a lot of spending trends in retail as well that are actually much higher than you would normally expect in a recession. And that's partly because of the government stimulus. It's also the super access. But largely, there's just a lot of dollars staying at home that would normally you see millions of Australians travel overseas, and that's just not happened this year. So in some ways, that's a net positive, more dollars being spent at home.
Sure. And interestingly, despite being in a recession, a lot of people are feeling their financial circumstances are better than they were before. And it's not because they're necessarily earning more, but lots of people are getting grants from the government or stimulus from the government. So we're not feeling as poor as maybe we would normally during a recession.
No, and I think it may well take a long period of time to wean people off some of those measures. But also, interest rate cuts, we had 5 in a year. So we've seen a record surge in refinancing, which effectively, for a lot of existing homeowners, just acts as effectively it's an interest rate cut. So people were previously paying 4%, now they're paying 3%, and a lot of new borrowers are paying nearer 2%. So that's helped to free up cash flow for a lot of households as well.
Sure, it's made the cash flow easier. I've recently locked in to 3-year interest rates in the low 2s. It's amazing, Pete, and it has made a difference to the cash flow.
Imagine if we were having this conversation in 2006 or 7, and we were, we couldn't have even dreamed of mortgage rates at that level. So it's pretty amazing.
I was happy when the interest rates got below 10, a double digit. We talked about not being able to travel overseas. It works in reverse. Therefore, people aren't coming to Australia. And I think the lower immigration is going to pull a plug on the economic growth, and it will affect housing demand in certain sectors, Pete.
Yeah, it's interesting that because GDP per capita, this was a longer complaint in Australia that we were growing the number of people, but the economy wasn't necessarily growing any more quickly as a result on a per capita basis. So certainly for the remainder of this year and probably into next year, immigration will be much, much lower, pretty close to zero really for overseas migration. So we'll just only have the natural growth in the population, so more births than deaths essentially. So that will change the dynamic for quite a while. I think eventually people will want to come again. There is this issue with international students. At the moment, a lot of them are working remotely, but I think there'll be a big push to bring them back simply because universities have become so leveraged in higher education, particularly to the Chinese students. So I think eventually ways will be found, but at the moment, that's quite a big hole there in terms of the headcount.
Definitely, and that's affecting employment in the tertiary institutions as well. So I guess in line with this, globalization is going to change. So a couple of years ago, we were all so proud how you could offshore things and spread globally. I think more people are going to try to bring their businesses, their supply chains locally. There's all these tensions occurring with China and the spying from China. That's an interesting thing too, the security. Well, sorry, I've got to be really careful. The alleged spying and security issues happening from China are going to suggest that maybe we're going to look at how we manufacture things, where we make things, where we buy things differently moving forward.
Yeah, supply chains is a big one. But when you go through a situation like this, health issue, people can't travel. A lot of countries looking towards more domestic solutions. I think a really interesting thing is just how globalization, it was a big trend, and that's really been slowed down by this. I think a big one for Australia is the relationship with China, with a number of countries around the world, particularly Trump. There's been some tensions there, as you mentioned, a more protectionist attitude from Trump. Now, he may well lose an election this year, which could de-escalate things. But Australia's had its own challenges with China. I suppose one counterpoint to that, though, is that for all of the noises being made out of China about the issues with Australia's relationship, it hasn't stopped iron ore imports running at the highest level in history. At the moment, we still think that the international students will come back. So maybe some of the damage there isn't quite as bad as it seems.
An interesting world of politics at the moment. Also, I see certain business models are going to change. I'm not sure what's going to happen to retail, but we're getting used to shopping online. I'm not sure what's going to happen to office space. I think more of us are going to learn to work from home for part of the time. Video conferencing means that I'm not going to have to travel interstate as often as I used to. It actually works this way, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have got used to the idea now of virtual meetings, and that can be good. I don't think we will see people move completely to remote working, though. I think a lot of businesses have experimented down this path before. And while it's okay for people to work from home some of the time, I think still most often people need to have interaction in person. But I think that said, I mean, over the next year or two, there will be some problems for businesses that are reliant on group gatherings, particularly things like live events and hospitality. Also, just for businesses that rely, restaurants, cafes, and so on, if they can't run at full capacity.
Well, I know you and I have fun every year at Wealth Retreat, and that's not going to be happening this year. And a lot of events have now been closed down, but hopefully people will be able to still have their personal events like weddings and good times and unfortunately funerals as well. So things are going to change in some ways, but it's going to affect certain demographics more than others. And you already hinted at it before. I think the younger generations are going to suffer more. Those entering the workforce or those who in their early years would be earning more, having a wide range of options to get in the workforce. Youth unemployment is actually spiking. It's higher than other demographics, isn't it?
Yeah, it's never fun for school leavers or graduates if they are leaving coming into the workforce in a downturn. As a new graduate, I had to, during my training as a chartered accountant, we went through a bit of a downturn there as the tech bubble unwound, and it was pretty tough. The people were, if you failed exams, you're out the door. There was a lot of pressure, but yeah, not much fun for new graduates in the current market, obviously. And it's pretty tough on school leavers as well. Many of them haven't been able to actually complete their studies this year. So, yeah, that's never fun. And it's typically that's really the cohort that gets hardest hit. They're quite marginal in the workforce often.
Interestingly, Treasury has warned young Australians are going to face 10 years of pay cuts as our economy is going to be slow for a while. It also suggests that youth unemployment is going to be high. And Treasury said that young people are likely to maybe earn 8% less in the first year of work and 3.5% less in the next 5 years. In other words, there is going to be some scarring and it is going to diminish their career prospects. And that's a real waste of potential because that's our next generation of business leaders, Pete.
Yeah, it definitely is. Now, I think this is what I was alluding to there on the shift to the left. I think there'll be quite a lot of frustration and anger for those younger people in the workforce, and they'll be looking to the government to actually provide solutions. And if they don't, that could be costly because we have compulsory voting in Australia, so you can't just ignore the younger voters.
One of the other things that's come to the fore is the importance of mental health. And unfortunately, people are finding it hard. Stress, anxiety, tension, and unfortunately depression and suicides. And that's a totally different argument about how much that's going to be affected by these lockdowns and the recession as opposed to saving lives through coronavirus. But I think one of the good things is that people are more aware of it and they know it's okay to ask for help. They're learning that what they're feeling is normal. But this isolation and loneliness is affecting a lot of people at the moment, Pete.
Yeah, and that's why I don't believe. I think in the short term, there's clearly been an outward shift in housing demand. More people are just taking rentals in Byron Bay and Lennox Head and Brunswick Heads and Blue Mountains. And I think in the short term, there's definitely that. But as you touched on there, I mean, humans are really social creatures. We like to be around other people. And that's what makes it so tough when you go through a shutdown or restrictive measures on movement. But I think over the medium term, I wouldn't bet against things going back pretty much exactly to how they were, with people largely congregating around the big cities. I think people often extrapolate what's happening right now way into the future, but the big mega trend over centuries has been to larger conurbations, and my bet is that will just continue, but it might take a while.
Sure. So recently, the statistics are showing that the new housing construction, particularly apartment construction, is waning. There's actually very little new pipeline of apartments. But having said that, there's lots sitting vacant at the moment. It'll be interesting to see if people are going to be comfortable getting back into those big high-rise towers, pressing the same buttons in the lift and holding the same stair rails and using the same communal laundries and gyms. But I agree with you. I think the younger generation are probably going to forget this sooner rather than later and get back to their normal life. They're going to be too busy getting on with life.
It always feels when you're in the midst of something that it will carry on in the same vein. But I mean, I've already speaking to friends and family in Britain, and people are just getting back in many parts of the country, just getting back to normal. It's taken a while, but we're only in August at the time of speaking, and it's already things are opening up. People are going to the pub, going to the cafes and restaurants, and that's a country where they've had seriously bad results from COVID. But people don't want to stay locked away forever, and they won't. So I think things are gradually mending and healing.
Now, one of the interesting things I thought with the recession and being locked up with COVID is that people using their credit cards more means that cash is going to disappear. Is this the end of cash? But I recently read that there are more $50 and $100 bills circulating than ever before. I guess people are pulling them out of banks and stashing them under their pillows or mattresses.
Yeah, I think that's it. There's more transactions happening now on cards, but also there has been some hoarding, not just loo rolls, but also cash, tins of beans, all sorts of things. And people might say that's sort of doom and gloom thinking, but actually with the loo rolls, it was quite wise in many cases because you simply couldn't get them in Noosa. They're all sold out.
Aha. The world after COVID is unlikely to return to the way it was before. Many trends already underway in the global economy have been accelerated by the impact of the pandemic, and there's some things that are going to change, but I believe that being humans, we don't like change that much, and some things are going to remain the same. So I look forward to chatting with you again about this on a regular basis. But Pete, if people want to get to understand more about you and read your new book, where do they find out about you, Pete?
Easiest place is just on my daily blog, Pete Wargent Blogspot. And as you mentioned, got a new book out at the moment. So that's lowrateshighreturns.com or just petewargent.com. There's most of my information there. So plenty of free content.
And the new book is talking about how to make money in this current environment.
Yeah, so low interest rates was the theme, and we certainly got that. So, good timing from that perspective. So that's largely focused on managing your money, managing your own money in the stock market.
And that was written before COVID. So you were already talking about low interest rates before they became even as low as they are today.
Yeah, so I co-authored that book actually with my colleague Stephen Moriarty, and we did sort of jokingly discuss between us, well, hopefully interest rates don't go up now we've written this book, but it doesn't look that way.
You're a fortune teller. Okay, Pete, look forward to catching up with you again on our regular sessions on the Michael Yardney podcast. Keep well. You're in England. I'm in Australia. It'll be interesting to see how our world evolves. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks, Michael.
In a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you. Interestingly, these are amongst the most popular segments of the Michael Yardney podcast. Well, that's what I hear from the feedback I'm getting. So I've got a special message for you. But before we do, I've got another quick message to remind you of what I just spoke about with Pete, that life will get normal again and our economy is going to pick up again. The Reserve Bank believes it's going to happen in the third or fourth quarter of 2020. In other words, various parts of the economy are already picking up, even though Victoria's sluggish at the moment for the reasons we understand. But as the economy picks up and life gets back to normal, so will our property markets. But there isn't one Melbourne property market, there isn't one Australian property market, there isn't one Sydney property market. So certain segments are going to do okay and some are still going to fall in value. I'm not an internal optimist. I'm a realist and I know what's going ahead. But it's therefore more important than ever, if you're interested in property investment, to own the type of property that's going to outperform the markets over the long term and not suffer in the short term. That means to achieve financial freedom in this new world of lower interest rate environment, all the things I just spoke about with Pete, you're going to need more than just a buyer's agent who basically takes orders. You're going to need more than the property strategist. You're going to need an advisor who takes a holistic approach to your wealth. And that's exactly what you get from the multi-award winning team at Metropole. The directors of Metropole have been around for a long time. It's not just me, but there's Ken Race and Mark Creedon, Kate Forbes, Brett Warren, Bryce Yardney, Greg Hankinson. We're old enough to have been around. Leanne Jobson. We've got a depth of experience through the ups and downs to help you. By the way, we don't sell property, but our services include strategic property advice, property planning, finance strategy, buyer's agency, wealth advisory, financial planning, property management, renovations, development. You can choose some of those services or the whole lot, and we'll then do ongoing portfolio review and evaluation. Why not go to metropole.com.au? And even if you're not ready to buy a property at the moment, get your ducks in a row so that when we move into the next phase of the cycle, you'll be ready to take advantage of the opportunities the market has to offer.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
Today, in my mindset message, I'd like to talk to you about ways to improve your life satisfaction. And I got the concept for today's chat from a blog I read from Rob Dix, who interestingly runs a British property podcast. And I was interested to read that he said that happiness is the art of wanting what you already have. Isn't that interesting? Let me repeat that. I think it's worth it. Happiness is the art of wanting what you already have. Now, somehow without trying, I think I've actually got this attitude. I'm happy with my life. When I'm at home in Melbourne, I'm happy here in Melbourne. When Pam and I travel overseas, not that we've done it this year, when we're travelling, I never want to come back. I'm happy with that. I'm happy with the food I've chosen at the restaurants. I think it's actually quite good. I don't actually say, oh, gee, that meal over there looks good. I don't want to swap my problems for somebody other problems when things go wrong either. In other words, the grass is always greener on my side of the fence than it is on the other side of the fence. And that's good. I'm happy pretty much of the time, and I don't really experience any sort of jealousy. Now, I know you could be saying, well, that's easy for you, Michael, because you've been lucky or you've achieved a lot and you're wealthy, and you're entirely right. But I also know plenty of extremely unhappy people with great material wealth and what others would consider wonderful lives. So I believe this wanting what you have attitude can be practiced whatever your current situation. So how do you do this? Well, I think the first thing you should do is practice noticing what's great about what you've got. You see, our mind has evolved to notice what's not good about our current situation, and that's on purpose to help us strive to improve. I think about it, if our ancestors sat around being thrilled that they had one bucket of grain to last them through the whole winter, none of us would be here today. So we unconsciously go through our day noticing that our house is too small, our children are being difficult, our job is dreary. So to counter this, my suggestion is to develop the habit of noticing what's great about what you've got. Your house is situated in a great suburb. Your kids are spirited. They're inquisitive. Your job has got great potential, and you've got the ability to then go home after your job and enjoy your life. So at the start, this is something you've sort of got to consciously force yourself to do. And I learned this technique many, many years ago. So every morning when I get up, I think of a list of things that I'm grateful for. I do that every day. And it's usually about 5 things. It's got to be different from the day before. Otherwise, you sort of cheat, don't you? Over time, though, this becomes a habit, crowding out the habit of noticing what you're not happy with. The second way to be more happy with what you've got in your life at the moment is to speculate about what's bad in somebody else's situation. Now, again, a natural instinct, and that's particularly more obvious today in the days of social media, is to look at somebody else's possessions or situations or jobs and want that for ourselves. It's difficult to want what we have, to be happy with what we've got when we're busy wanting what somebody else has got. So I'm going to suggest you try the habit of reverse jealousy. Go out of your way to point out what might not be so good about somebody else's situation. Wow, the logistics of staffing that business with 60, 80 employees and all the hassles that come with that must be a nightmare. Oh, look, that kid, he may be really good at sport, but he actually doesn't have much of a social life because every weekend he's got to be training. Oh, he must be constantly worried about his beautiful new Lamborghini car that people are going to scratch it if he takes it out in public. So, now, long term, this isn't healthy. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't be happy for other people's success. In fact, that's one of the traits of successful people, that they're happy when other people are successful. But I'm suggesting this more as a deprogramming exercise to kickstart your own satisfaction, flipping your potential jealousy for other people, noticing, hey, what's not so good about it? Because remember, we tend to see our problems in more detail than others. There's no such thing as a perfect marriage, a perfect business, a perfect job, a perfect house, a fantastic property portfolio, perfect health, or a perfect anything, really. We've all got worries, insecurities, frustrations, niggles, aches and pains, and there's a myriad of ways. Everyone's life is far from perfect. It's just when you've got a front row seat for these imperfections in your own life and you only see others fleetingly or from a distance, this magnifies what you see as your own problems. And of course, as I said a moment ago, social media, where people go out of their way to present a very filtered, staged, managed image of what their perfect life is, that makes it hard for us to compare what's going on with our life. So it's important to remind yourself of this frequently until you internalise it, that, hey, that's not the real world. Reality TV isn't real either. Otherwise, you can never be happy with what you've got because you're never going to live up to that illusionary perception of what other people have got. Now, another thing you should do is balance happiness with the drive to improve and progress. Like I said, persistent dissatisfaction is a powerful motivator. So if you become too satisfied with your lot in life, it may end up losing your drive. So I suggest you really got to balance the two. When it comes to your possessions and your family and your standing in life, you should want what you have, making sure you keep harmful envy at bay and appreciate the small moments that you have each day. And a lot of us who've had to stay home, be more locked up through COVID, have suddenly learned to appreciate different things, haven't they? But it's also okay to be dissatisfied with your professional progress or your sporting prowess or your ability to understand a particular problem or subject or your station in life. You want to get better and you want to not compare with other people, but you want to do better for yourself. So as long as it doesn't become an obsession and sits within the framework of your overall life happiness, wanting more than you've currently got is actually a good, useful, powerful motivator. Well, I told you at the beginning of the show that this isn't going to be all doom and gloom, and life is going to get back to whatever normal's going to be, and it's going to be good. And if you got some inspiration from this and understand what's ahead, please let somebody else know by using the share button on whatever podcast app you're listening to, or just tell somebody about the Michael Yardney podcast. Even better, tell the world by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this. If I read your review out, as I'm about to for Joe, I'm going to say thank you if you email me, michael@metropole.com.au. If you let me know I've read out your review, I'll give you one of my books. Now, Joe left a great review saying, great podcast, very informative and unbiased podcast on how to grow wealth. I've been listening to it for a month now and liked it so much I went back for previous episodes, bought his books and signed up for a property strategy with Metropole. Thanks. Well, thank you, Joe, for trusting us to be part of your wealth journey. Now, again, Joe's point's a good one. There's so much in all those old episodes there, the previous episodes. So why not listen to them? By the way, you can listen to them at 1.5 times speed. That's how I listen to podcasts. You're going to get the gist of it. I still sound good that way too. I look forward to catching up with you again real soon, twice a week for the Michael Yardney podcast. But you can catch me on social media. Just look for Michael Yardney and you can catch up with what I'm doing or my daily property update newsletter.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?